So welcome here, everyone. We're just going to take a few more seconds before we get started to allow people to enter in. There's still people coming into the webinar, but we are very pleased that you're here with us tonight, um, where we're going to discuss a consistent ethic of life, navigating Catholic engagement with U.S. politics. And this is not just a webinar discussing that topic, but it actually is the title of a book, and I am going to try to hold it up on the blurred background so you can all see it. It's by Paulist Press, and Steve Millies, our guest this evening, has written this book, A Consistent Ethic of Life, Navigating Catholic Engagement with U.S. Politics. And so that will form the basis. And Dr. Jane Barder is here as well from the University of Winnipeg, and I will begin to introduce them in just one moment. So again, welcome to you all. I'm very excited that we have both of our distinguished guests here today. Welcome to this webinar presented by the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia. I'm Dr. John Martins, the director of the center. Fang Chandra, the administrative assistant for the center, is also here with us, making certain everything works smoothly, and she's already done that up to this point. The webinar will last probably between an hour and a half, and there will be time for your questions. And we're so happy you're joining us from all over North America. This webinar is going to discuss Catholic engagement with U.S. politics. And as I've said a few times already, you might not have been aware, but there's an election that's going on in the United States. But with this upcoming American election, a lot of major issues have been raised in many quarters. But from a Catholic perspective, there are particular issues with respect to how Catholics in the U.S. engage with politics. But there's also a question also about how Canadian Catholics and Christians more generally engage. And so the discussion today will provide a guide for those wondering how to faithfully navigate the complex ethical dilemmas voters face, and today, especially in the US, but also in Canada. And as I mentioned already, apart from Dr. Steve Millies, we have Dr. Jane Barder here from the University of Winnipeg. And the webinar is sponsored by the Philip Brocking Lectureship, a lectureship which seeks to understand and strengthen U.S.-Canadian ties, especially politically. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time just introducing our speakers, and I'm going to introduce them both now so that when they begin to speak, they can have the floor. Dr. Stephen P. Millies' scholarship explores the Catholic Church's relation to politics from a perspective that encompasses history, theology, law, ethics, sociology, philosophy, and political theory, in line with Pope Francis's call for, quote, a politics which is far-sighted and capable of a new, integral, and interdisciplinary approach. Dr. Millies' work challenges a view of politics as merely a conflict over individual interests. Instead, politics is seen as a conviction, and here again quoting Pope Francis, that we need one another, that we have a shared responsibility for each other and the world. Currently, Dr. Millies is the director of the Bernardin Center at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he is also a professor of public theology and the director of the Bernardin Center. After Dr. Millies speaks, Dr. Jane Barder will speak. She holds a PhD from the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and her research interests include political theology, theopolitics, memory, and violence. And she's published 2 monographs on Christian theology, Lord, Giver of Life, and Thinking Christ, Christology and Contemporary Critics, and co-edited with Doris Kieser of St. Joseph's College, University of Alberta, a special volume of the Journal of Moral Theology on the papal visit and apology to survivors of residential schools in Canada. And she's just recently completed a monograph titled Theopolitics and the Era of the Witness, which is being published by Routledge Press. So she will speak after Steve. And then we're going to allow, if there is any questions that Steve and Jane have, will allow them to talk for a few minutes before we open it up to general audience questions. And so if you have questions at any point, put them into the chat or into Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Just before I turn it over to Steve, I'm going to start the night's discussion with a quote from a Canadian-American and Chicagoan author, Saul Bellow. Those of you who know the great Saul Bellow, Nobel Prize winner, who was born in Quebec and spent most of his life in Chicago. And this is from his short story, Him with His Foot in His Mouth. quote, my tracks were covered and I took off for Canada, a foreign country in which my own language, or something approaching it, is spoken. There I was to conclude my life in peace and at an advantageous rate of exchange. I have developed a certain sympathy with Canada. It's no easy thing to share a border with the USA. Canada's chief entertainment, it has no choice, is to watch from a gorgeous setting what happens in our country. The disaster is that there is no other show. Night after night, they sit in darkness and watch us on the lighted screen. So welcome to this lighted screen and the possibility here tonight, not just to watch in the darkness, but to talk back a bit at the darkness and with our speakers shed some light. So please do welcome Dr. Steve Millies.
Thank you so much. I want to begin certainly by offering my warmest thanks to Professor Martins, Professor Barter, to Fangfang Chandra, to the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's College, where I've been now 2 or 3 times and look forward to coming back again next year. This is a relationship that I enjoy that's been so fruitful. I've gotten to meet so many people up in the community there just in my trips up there. So it's wonderful to be back with you. John, I did not know that quote from Bellow. I'd never heard that before. That's rather marvelous, and I hope it both does and doesn't describe our relationship. But that's tremendous. What a great way to begin. So I'm very grateful for this. As John said, as we got underway, I have a book out, A Consistent Ethic of Life, and that's what I'll be principally talking about here. A book that I wrote in the wake of our Supreme Court here in the U.S.'s Dobbs v. Jackson decision that reversed the Supreme Court's 1973 decision, Roe versus Wade, that had legalized abortion and recognized it as a constitutional right here in the United States. That fact transformed political life here in the United States. I won't talk too much about that. I've written another book about that. We can talk about that. But I wrote this book now from a conviction that Dobbs had fundamentally shifted the landscape, that the abortion politics of the last 4 or 5 decades here had been, I think, quite destructive and quite ineffective, and that we find ourselves at a moment where it's time to take stock and ask ourselves, is there another approach that perhaps might be more fruitful? We've been trying one thing as Roman Catholics in the United States, and I should say too, I think that the preoccupation with that issue has had its effect on the church throughout the world as well. That's certainly been a flavor of some of our conversations as I've come up and visited you there in Vancouver. And so I think for all of us, what I'm saying is that we're in a fundamentally new moment at the end of several decades of something that I think has brought us to a conclusion that has satisfied no one. It's a good time to ask whether there's a new way that we can approach this. And the answer, I think, is that there's an old way we can approach this, which is the consistent ethic of life. It's for that reason that I wrote a book that is, I think, quite brief. It's barely 100 pages. I wrote it with the hope that it would be useful for parishes, for classrooms, for settings like this, as a way to introduce a consistent ethic of life that has been around now for quite a while. By way of introducing what I mean, let me say that during these decades that I've talked about, since the 70s, since the 80s, it's become, I think, because of the abortion politics, quite common to take an issues-based approach to thinking about the challenges of Catholic citizenship, both as voters, but also in the other ways that we interact with the political community. It's become very common to have these sorts of voters' guides, these sorts of issues-based ways of thinking about, here is a list of moral issues for us to think about as we approach these tasks of citizenship. And the thing I want to begin by saying is that there's, I think, a real challenge we should identify when we talk about issues that way, because by naming any issues, we're never going to name all of the threats to human life, all of the problems that arise. So anytime we identify a list of issues, we're already narrowing the scale of our engagement with political life. That's the problem with a voter's guide approach, because our behavior as citizens and our lives as believers are contextual and particular. As both citizens and believers, we experience things contextually and particularly from where we are, from within the horizon of our own experience, from our social location, from our geographical location, from the moment in time where we find ourselves. All of these things are particular to me as they are particular to you, but they are different. And we see the problems differently, each of us from within that horizon, where we all see and prioritize the issues as best as we can appreciate what they are from where each of us begins. In our engagement with issues, especially in the Catholic Church, it's become very popular to begin from the way that moral theology gives priority to ethical problems or to particular threats to human life. This is what many of the voters' guides for Catholics do, that we begin with the most grave threats and we sort of go down a prioritized list that way. And this, I want to say also, I think is quite unhelpful, even though it mirrors the moral theology, even though it mirrors the way in which we do recognize that there are differences between the threats that we face as human beings in life and the world. When we approach these things as a list of moral problems, the trouble there, I think, is that we're approaching them as abstractions. In other words, we are approaching abortion, or we are approaching the death penalty, or we are approaching poverty, but we are not thinking about the persons who are experiencing those things. And we are also not thinking about them in the context from which I am encountering them. So we approach these things, I'm saying, when we do it that way, as abstractions. But political life is particular in that way that I've said. And I particularly would want to say that we don't always have the opportunity to be practically effective on the most grave moral questions. I think certainly that was true about abortion here in the United States from 1973 until 2022. It was a constitutional right. It was beyond the reach of the ballot. There simply wasn't all that much that we could do effectively about that issue as voters and citizens. And while we were giving that issue such abstract priority, as the moral theology does require us to do, but while we were giving it that abstract priority, there were a lot of other threats to the human person that we were not engaging with, threats that we perhaps might have engaged effectively from within our own context, from within the horizon of our own experience. We might have done more practical good for actual suffering, vulnerable human beings. Instead, we were sort of preoccupied by an abstract problem like a classroom exercise. And that, I think, we can say after decades has not done all that much good. We lost sight of particularity. We lost sight of context, and we abandoned our own judgment, I would want to say too, as we encounter the landscape of challenges to the human person, the opportunities that arise in public life. We abandoned our judgment to an abstract list of priorities. I would be one who would say human beings have suffered because of that. So, as I say, I think we have reached a point where we have to do some stock taking. And I think we can be somewhat liberated by the developments of Dobbs versus Jackson. I can talk about the reasons why, if you like, perhaps later. Certainly in the US, I think we can be somewhat liberated because the two political parties, they're still talking like there's a great difference between them on this one preoccupying, or as our bishops say, preeminent issue. They're still talking like there's a great difference between them. But if you look at the statements of the presidential nominees, and if you look at the platforms of the two parties, I don't really find it. So I'm saying we are in a new moment that invites us to begin anew, to really step back and ask, is there something else we can do? The right place, I want to say, to begin as we do that is with a consistent ethic of life. And here I would want to say that the consistent ethic of life is not new. I didn't invent it. It's been here for a long time. It is the authoritative magisterial teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. I'll talk about that in a moment. It arose in its deepest history, and I talk about this in the book. The first four chapters of the book are a history of where the consistent ethic came from and how it developed. The fifth chapter of the book offers some thoughts about how we might apply it in this world that we live in now, in 2024 particularly. But the deepest roots of the consistent ethic come from the Vietnam War. the U.S. Engagement in the war in Vietnam from 1954 until 1975. But even more deeply, the consistent ethic of life actually begins with the Second Vatican Council. And here, if I might, I would like to quote a kind of a lengthy passage, but I think it's important because it sets the context for us in a helpful way. This is from paragraph 27 of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. And just hear this, listen very closely, and I'll talk about why I think it's so important. These are the fathers of the Second Vatican Council in that constitution. Quote, whatever is opposed to life itself, such as any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, torments inflicted on body or mind, attempts to coerce the will itself, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions, where persons are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their like are infamies. They poison human society. Moreover, they are a supreme dishonor to the Creator. Now, I think that quotation is very important. And the reason it is because it does sort of actually offer a ranked list. If you go down that list, you get a sense of priority in the threats to human life as they're being enumerated there in that paragraph. But the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council are doing something also, I think, quite subtle but very important. They're also illustrating for us the way in which we can't neatly disentangle these issues. Because we have to begin from within the particular horizon of a person's experience, we all know that we all encounter various threats, and it is about how those threats are encountered in the actual life of a person. Once we think of it that way, we can't neatly disentangle the issues. The person who proposed a consistent ethic of life was the Archbishop of Chicago, here where I am right now, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin. He was our bishop here from 1982 until 1996. Between 1980 and 1983, Cardinal Bernardin led the bishops of the United States, writing a pastoral letter on war and peace in the nuclear age, really engaging the morality of nuclear war. There's quite a lot in the book about this document. It's extremely important. I don't want to take a lot of time here talking about it. But I want to say that Cardinal Bernardin was moved to propose a consistent ethic of life because of that pastoral letter on nuclear war. He realized at the end of that process, investigating the question together with the rest of the bishops of the United States, whether it was moral to engage in an arms race, to build nuclear weapons that we expected could actually be used, that could kill innocents on a mass scale, that could threaten every life on Earth. At the end of that process, Cardinal Bernardin came to a sort of a realization. And the realization took the form of a question. If we imagine a world where all abortions stopped, which has never happened, but if we imagine that world where all abortions stopped, and every pregnancy resulted in a birth, what good would it actually do for a child to be born into a world that could be destroyed 5 minutes later by nuclear war? And here again, we get a sense of the interrelatedness of these issues. We know that we can't disentangle poverty, education, access to healthcare, and a lot of other things from abortion. And Cardinal Bernardin would make the point as well, we can't even disentangle nuclear war from it. We need a different framework. We need a different way to approach the threats to the human person as we encounter them in public life. And so what Cardinal Bernardin proposed was a consistent ethic of life, sometimes also called the seamless garment. And that metaphor of the seamless garment drawn from the gospel, Jesus's cloak that was woven from whole cloth, that metaphor is again meant to call our attention to the way that we can't just separate the issues. We can't abstractly isolate them from one another. It's the way we encounter them in life that actually matters. And then when we encounter them in life, knowing that we are all going to have different perspectives from within our own horizon, appreciate our ability to offer effective assistance to vulnerable, suffering people from within the horizon of our own experience. Cardinal Bernardin offered us this way of thinking about it, that we don't begin with issues. We begin instead with a desire, with a morally serious reflection that it ends in a desire to be consistent witnesses to human life in every case. And this brings me then to a short description of the consistent ethic of life. And again, there's so much I could say about it, but I will simply say this. I've spent a lot of time talking to some of the people who helped Cardinal Bernardin develop the consistent ethic of life between 1983 and 1996, principally the theologian who worked with him on most of the talks that he gave. When I talk to that theologian today, what he always says about the consistent ethic of life is that it's not a voter's guide. It's not a list of issues. It's not a way to vote. It's nothing like that. What the consistent ethic of life is first is a call to spiritual conversion. It's a spirituality. It is a way to deepen our own conversion in the context of how we live as citizens and neighbors and friends with one another in the social world. And in this way, the consistent ethic of life is quite well suited to particularity and to complexity. Cardinal Bernardin often described the consistent ethic himself as an attitude or as a posture. We might say that it's just a way of approaching the challenges that we encounter as citizens. And as a call to spiritual conversion, what the consistent ethic really is a call to overcome our partisan attitudes and our partisan instincts. The National Catholic Reporter here in the United States ran a report about a poll that they did about a month ago, engaging Catholics here in the United States on a wide variety of issues. And what they did was they re-verified what has been proved by many polls across the last several years. Catholic Republicans here in the United States look just like Republicans on the issues. Catholic Democrats, people who identify as Democrats and as Catholics, look just like Democrats. We yield, we give way to our partisanship too often before we give way to what the gospel asks of us. What the consistent ethic of life is doing is it's attempting to disrupt how our partisanship overwhelms our faith. The consistent ethic isn't a voter's guide telling us how to vote. The consistent ethic of life is asking us to approach those questions from a desire to begin from the gospel and ask, how can I do the most effective good from where I am today? And by asking the question that way, if we are spiritually and morally serious about it, then we have to be willing to be surprised. We actually have to sometimes find ourselves surprised by the way that might lead us to act politically. We might vote for a party that we find quite surprising. We might have rejected a candidate in a prior election, and now in the new context where we find ourselves today, perhaps we vote for that candidate. We move around because we don't have a fundamentally partisan commitment. We have a commitment to the gospel, and we have a commitment to actually doing good, not a commitment to an abstract solution to a problem that's unrelated to the concrete lives we live here in the world. And so in this way, the consistent ethic of life is particular. It's contextual. It's individual. Because from within the horizon of my experience, and as I see the suffering and vulnerable around me, I might come to a decision that might be different from someone who lives here in the house with me, one of my neighbors, someone I work with, equally Catholic, but still coming to a different conclusion about the best thing we can do. The consistent ethic of life permits us, if we engage in that moral reflection, and if we pursue it in a spiritually serious way, when we use our judgment about how we can actually be effective, the consistent ethic of life permits us to reach different conclusions, still as faithful Catholics. And moreover, as I've been saying, it permits me to reach different conclusions from moment to moment, from year to year, from election to election. Because the world around me is dynamic. It's constantly changing. My understanding of the world should also be changing, and this is another important part of the consistent ethic. As I inform my conscience, I also have to be paying close attention to the world so that I can fulfill the obligation of my baptism and be responsive in an effective way to the suffering person. I'm often so grateful to Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti for using the parable of the Good Samaritan as a way to think about social friendship. The obligation we have isn't to respond to an abstract list of moral issues. The obligation we have is to identify the beaten person who's been robbed and is lying at the side of the road that I'm walking down. It's particular and it's concrete, and it depends on my appreciating how I can be effective in a way that's near at hand. I begin with what I can do, in other words. I begin with where I know I can be effective. And if I do that, if I've informed my conscience, if I've studied the problems, if I have reflected on it in prayer, if I am thinking about this as part of my ongoing call to conversion and fulfilling the promises of my baptism, then I cannot be doing wrong as a Catholic citizen. That's what the consistent ethic of life tells us, that the goodness of our political action begins and ends with our desire to be consistent witnesses to the gospel. I've said at the beginning that the consistent ethic of life is the authoritative teaching of the church. I'll just say briefly, not only do the U.S. bishops here accept the consistent ethic of life in their own voter's guide, Forming Consciences for for Faithful Citizenship, but Pope John Paul II accepted the consistent ethic of life into the papal magisterium in 1995 in paragraph 87 of his encyclical, The Gospel of Life. There's just no room for doubting the consistent ethic is what the church requires from us, but it's been suppressed now for more than 40 years, I would say, by the abortion politics that I've talked about, by this issues-based and rather abstract way of approaching political problems and the challenges of citizenship. We have now in front of us an opportunity and I think a real need to recover what the consistent ethic is, what it invites us to do, what Pope John Paul called to our attention, what the U.S. bishops still do, what Cardinal Bernardin tried to offer us with the consistent ethic, a way to really appreciate the great responsibility that we have, but also to take seriously our obligation to be effective, to actually do good, and not to do good in an abstract way that doesn't actually help others. Issue lists, I'm saying, won't help us. Voters' guides are not what we need. There are all sorts of Catholic ways to vote. There are all sorts of Catholic ways to be a good, believing citizen. If we begin in our conscience from a converted and morally serious desire to be consistent with the gospel. If we choose our action that way, we're not acting wrongly. I do want to say one last thing, though, by way of conclusion. And that is that for as much as I've called your attention to issues throughout the course of my remarks here and talked about them in a variety of ways, John mentioned our upcoming election here in the United States. I do feel an obligation. My degrees actually are in political science. I'm not really a theologian. As a political scientist, I don't think we're in an issues election here in the United States. And I think as we have seen things happening around the globe for the last 10 years or so, I think we have to recognize there are bigger questions at stake than particular issues about foreign policy, healthcare policy, economic policy. There are bigger issues at stake. We know, especially since January 6, 2021 here in the United States, that there are bigger questions. But most of the elections in our lifetimes have been about different issue positions. Candidate A feels this way, candidate B feels that way. We have a very well-developed instinct to think about elections and politics that way. What's in front of us now, certainly in the States, but I think increasingly around the globe too, what's in front of us now is something bigger. It is, in fact, the real possibility of politics itself. It is our constitutional systems. It's the rule of law. It's accepting election outcomes. It's accepting judicial findings. It's accepting basic facts about our public life. No one is creating hurricanes. No one is eating dogs and cats. We have to share the same fact-based universe, and we have to respect the rules, the procedures of our constitutional systems. We have to accept the possibility that we can lose. And here's what's important. That's not partisan. That's not partisan. There are things that aren't two-sided. There are things where there's only one correct answer. No one's eating the dogs and cats. No one's creating hurricanes. And what's at stake for us as these things have become contested is politics itself in this way I've said. If you go into any politics 100 classroom at any undergraduate institution, you'll find someone like me introducing what politics is by saying that politics is what we have to deal with the conflicts that arise inevitably in social life. Politics is how we address those conflicts without violence. And whatever diminishes our capacity to resolve our conflicts peacefully through politics leaves us only violence as the alternative. This is why I gesture toward January 6, 2021 here in the United States. Whatever threatens politics puts us on the road to violence. Whatever leaves violence as the only alternative is a grave threat to life that overrides issues and other differences between candidates and parties. Or at least that's my judgment as a political scientist in this election. I think we are obligated to really stand for what politics is, for what the rule of law is, because what they are the peaceful mechanisms by which we live together to protect and promote human life together in the day-to-day life that we have as citizens and as voters. I certainly hope we will return one day very soon to issues elections and quarrel with one another about the different prudential questions between position A and position B. 2024, I am saying, is a different sort of thing and also asks us to engage in a morally serious reflection in the light of a consistent ethic, or at least that's the way it seems to me. But with that, I invite Jane to respond and offer some thoughts as well and get a good conversation going here. And I thank everybody for listening to me as I've talked here tonight.
Millie's, and thank you to St. Mark's for the invitation to be a respondent, and particularly to Fang Fang and to John for being showing such incredible hospitality. So thank you all for this invitation. It's truly an honor. I'm not going to be speaking extemporaneously. I have a text before me, so pardon me in advance if I'm boring you with my reading. I'll try to make it as animated as possible, though. Dr. Millie's important book affords a means of navigating U.S. politics by engaging the Catholic tradition through the framework of a consistent ethic of life. Drawing from the work of Cardinal Bernardin, particularly, this project seeks to use this important ethic of life in finding a way through the morass that present-day politics and its polarization represents. A consistent ethic of life, as Millie's argues, must, quote, involve the promotion of human life, must guide our conscience toward ethical and political decisions that reflect the most prudent choices that are available, end quote. It is, quote, a strategy for faithful Catholic citizenship. It is a roadmap for every Catholic about how to think about public issues and to present a Catholic way of thinking to non-Catholic fellow citizens in the ongoing dialogue in the public square, end quote. One of the most enduring and important legacies of the consistent ethic of life is that it does not isolate questions of personal moral issues, such as abortion and euthanasia, from broader political and collective ones. Thus, the war in Vietnam, the nuclear arms race, and climate emergency were regarded by various Catholic theologians and movements to be equally morally urgent to Catholics as other kinds of issues, such as abortion. This appeal to broaden the ethic of life won a share of opponents for Bernardin and others, not least of which was the infamous Phyllis Schlafly, the vociferous opponent to reproductive rights for women. According to her, the broadening of the ethic of life to social and political issues risked sabotaging the pro-life movement. Many followed Schlafly's logic and worried that an emphasis on various social movements, such as poverty and justice, would relativize those very claims about life and its sanctity that were deemed essential, namely, again, abortion and euthanasia. My concern, as you might imagine, is somewhat different. It is not a partisan one, but it is a hermeneutical one. It is a question of the interpretation of life, and precisely of whose life matters, or as Judith Butler put it provocatively, whose life is grievable. When we are speaking about open grief, writes Butler, we are talking about affective responses that are highly regulated by regimes of power and sometimes subject to explicit censorship, end quote. Does a consistent ethic of life adequately interpret and expose those regimes of power by which our affects are unwittingly regulated and at times censored? Does it recognize that an ethic of life is contingent upon various intellectual but also affective responses that are culturally and politically mediated? Most obviously, to what degree has Catholic moral theology recognized the precarity of women's lives that are subject to unwanted pregnancies, especially in the context of male violence, women's poverty, and the globalized industry that is sex trafficking? What forces are regulating our effective responses so that we are able to recognize the life of the fetus as a life worthy of saving, and a woman or a girl's flourishing as expendable? As Millais points out, subsequent articulations of the consistent ethic of life sought to help us to recognize precisely the social nature of an ethic of life through its emphasis upon solidarity, a principle of Catholic social teaching which moves us to conversion in our encounter with the other. Yet Butler's question remains: whose lives are grievable, and what are the forces at work that obscure both suffering of those beyond our purview and our complicity within it? Is a consistent ethic of life capable of recognizing its own affective biases, even when solidarity is promoted as a principle? Consider Pope Francis's recent visit to Canada, in which he apologized to survivors of the church-run residential schools. By all accounts, Francis's face-to-face encounters with Indigenous survivors was humble, penitent, and pastoral. And yet he too failed to recognize the manner in which the suffering of Indigenous people was directly related not to a few individuals who were running the schools, but rather a system, a structure in which the Catholic Church was a major actor, if not the architect thereof. As Francis stated in his apology, sorry for the ways in which regrettably many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppress the indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, etc., etc. So how might a consistent ethic of life not only recognize and stand in solidarity with the suffering of Indigenous people, but also speak to the church's structural role in that suffering? And here we must come to view political responsibility in these polarized times not simply as the work of conscience to discern among various alternatives, but to recognize how contaminated political life in the West is by a culture of death, a culture that Christians must not only discern, but must also prophesy against, even and especially as it infects the churches. The hermeneutical problems of discerning a consistent ethic of life and our appropriate response in an impossible election such as this one is endless. What happens when the promotion of life of one group has a diminishing and often lethal effect upon another? Catholic social teaching speaks of the priority of the poor, but who are the poor? And how are some of the poor obscured by the very practices that constitute our politics and our theologies? And here I think, of course, particularly of the question of Palestine. Politically, the situation in Gaza should give us pause about the tragic inapplicability of an ethic of life in the case of discernment in this US election. In this instance, both the Republicans and the Democrats are keenly attached to the preservation of Israel through the unyielding assault on Palestinian and now upon Lebanese life. Harris no less than Trump, for she claimed that she would not do anything differently than Joe Biden did in supporting Israel without reservation since October 7th. Of course, Professor Millais is not suggesting that we can achieve anything close to perfection through our participation in official US politics today. But he is suggesting that we can make better or worse moral choices that are consistent with an ethic of life, quote, in light of new circumstances and exercising prudential judgment in light of our consistent concern for life, end quote. I am not so sure. What this election brings into greatest relief is that both parties are operating according to the same ethic or non-ethic in the case of Palestine. both are resolved to support and arm Israel at just about any cost to Palestinian life. What is less evident are the financial and the racial imperatives that underwrite this position. Without a thorough probing on these, and on all moral issues, not just on this war, a true ethic of life remains opaque. Whose life do we uphold, and whose do we deny, and why? And how do we even begin to determine this when the narrative is so obscured by the propaganda and the censorship of our time? In an important essay in his Theological Metaphors of Marx, Catholic theologian Enrique Dussel challenged Catholic social doctrine for its inconsistent application of the question of human dignity, because it fails to see how certain members of society are virtually unable to attain a measure of dignity without the radical restructuring of society. He writes, quote, "Those who recognize the excluded other, therefore recognize the difference of the other. That is a difference from those who enjoys the fruits of unalienated labor and requires a creation of a new community, a new institutionality. In other words, a consistent ethic of life cannot be adequately achieved without a dramatic restructuring of society, in which an increasing majority of individuals who are denied life or dignity live. Certainly, it cannot be done through American electoral politics today." Professor Millies has given us a roadmap to seeing beyond polemics. He has challenged Catholics to think beyond the political polarization that characterizes much of contemporary American life today. My only concern is that in the absence of precisely the political changes that foster a consistent ethic of life for all, we are left with an impossible set of choices. Woman versus fetus, labor versus environment, worker versus worker, Israeli Jew versus Palestinian. Given these historical and material structures operating today, we are compelled to ask whose life demands our urgent protection, and what are the operations of power, including racism, capitalism, sexism, and our theologies themselves that may obscure those lives most in need of protection. Without answering these questions first, a consistent ethic of life may unwittingly remain inconsistent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Steve. We appreciate both of your comments. I wanted to give you some time. We are still waiting for questions to come in. So before I or anyone else in the audience asks any questions, are there things, Steve, that you would like to respond to with respect to Jane's really wonderful remarks in response?
A very rich reflection, and I'm really grateful for it. I'm really grateful for it. I don't want to maybe offer a response
Mm.
because largely I agree. What I want to do is maybe give voice to just what arises in me as I listen to it, and along a number of vectors as you were talking, I found myself going back to something we haven't talked about at all, and is quite off subject. But it was Francis's statutes for the International Theological Commission, Ad Theologiam Promovendam, that came out, I think, at the end of last year or the beginning of this year, if I'm remembering correctly, where Francis asked the theological community to engage in a truly contextual theology. That is to fundamentally reorient the theological task so that it begins in this contextual way, recognizing the differences in our histories and where we are coming from and how the kinds of differences that you were talking about a moment ago. I think, when we think about whose life is grievable, which is a wonderful question, it's an important question. When we think about whose life is grievable, it seems to me the boundaries of our response are in fact fixed by the Catholic tradition and by the history of the Church. The Church has arisen in a particular, and we should say Western and Northern history, together with other contextual things we would want to say. The boundaries on whose life is grievable are fixed by that reality, by those contexts. In a similar way, I would say the geopolitical decisions that are made by the US government or by other governments as well are also bounded by history and context. And I think the question that arises for me as I listen to a wonderful reflection, the question that arises for me is what can break that horizon open? It seems to me that's the question you're driving at. What can expand the horizon? What can broaden my sense of the care that I am bound to have for all life, even in the bewildering circumstances where, as you say, labor versus environment, woman versus fetus, they're extremely challenging problems, but the problem is made all the worse. The problem is made all the worse by the fact that we live within a history that confines our moral reflection and our spiritual engagement with one another. I would say I have some optimism that the consistent ethic, because of its call to spiritual conversion, in tandem with the call to a contextual theology, gives us a place to begin. But here I would say very cautiously. And you're quite right. I certainly don't believe I'm a little too Augustinian to believe that perfection is something we're going to achieve through politics. Um, but I do have to believe the eschatological promises that have been given to us. I have to believe in a synodal way and in a Pentecostal way that the Spirit is here with us. I have to believe that as we have been called to this contextual engagement, as we have been given a consistent ethic of life, as we know God is with us, that the possibility exists for us to keep doing better. But it really is radically my problem. And it depends on my taking those things that we have been talking about here very seriously each time I do it, never resting on habit or convention or the comfort of my own context. It needs to be challenging, it needs to be surprising. And if we are not willing to be surprised by God in those ways, then I think certainly we're doing it wrong. Not a response as such, but just my own reflection and what rose to my mind listening to you. And I'm very grateful for your remarks.
Thank you so much. May I just say a brief thing in response, John? I'm glad that you began with Francis on contextual theology, and I suspect we're all aware of the very recent death, I think it was last week, of Father Gustavo Gutierrez. And to me, I think the part that might be missing, perhaps in a lot of these discussions about contextual theology, is precisely what Gustavo did, which was to recognize that context involves political structures, political powers, right? So it's not just who am I, where am I, what is going on, but what are the operations of power that are in place that are limiting my life? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We do have questions coming in now, and quite a few here. So I'll put this one out. I think, Steve, it might be intended for you. The question is the discussion supposed to be centered on the legalization of abortion rather than on whether abortion itself is acceptable? And I take it that's a question that's being asked about the political context in the US, maybe in Canada as well. I'm not sure. But if questioner wanted perhaps to add some context to that, that would be might be welcome.
Well, if any comes over, let me just say, and I'll say briefly, I think legalization is the only political question. And among the reasons I say that is certainly because we know that the vital question of abortion when a human life begins is not a question the religious traditions agree about. And indeed, some of the traditions that are most nearly kindred to Western Christianity, and I would name Eastern Christianity as well as Judaism, but others as well, have a different answer to the question from our answer to the question. So what I would say particularly is to the degree that the political question is about legalization in a political and social context where people who believe different things must live together in peace. I think if we Roman Catholics take what we ourselves believe about the primacy of conscience in religious matters, we need to approach this question with a lot more humility. And that is even before we get to the question of taking seriously, I think, what medical science has not only taught us, but demonstrated quite forcefully to us in the last couple of years, to say nothing of the last century. We understand the challenge of reproduction a lot better over the last several decades than we did throughout human history before us. Our tradition, I think, has an obligation to engage that seriously as well, because we believe in the meeting of faith and reason. and that these things aren't exclusive to one another. What medical science is telling us, what we're learning about the complexity of women's bodies, about what happens in pregnancy, particularly when pregnancy goes wrong, we need to take serious moral notice of that. But all of that comes back really to a question a political community has to make together about how we want to handle those things. But if we don't handle them in a way that's good for all of us, or thinking at least about all of us, then obviously I think we're missing something.
Thank you. I'm not sure, Jane, if you wanted to jump in there. If not, I will ask the next question. A question: are we still supposed to vote based on lesser evil considerations? The general consensus here is that the Democrats in the US are the lesser evil, and I think here might mean Canada. They are not actively overthrowing election results. I think about Trump's coup attempt in January 2021. However, as Dr. Barter says, both Democrats and Republicans are still funding Israel, despite massacres of Palestinians and Lebanese people. So I suspect the question then is, how do considerations of lesser evil play into that?
Well, I think those are prudential questions. Those are questions that we have to approach, each of us, in a serious way in prayer and in spiritual discernment. I've mentioned before, I'm Augustinian enough. I don't expect perfection in politics, but what that actually means too is that all of the choices that we face, politically, socially, in our lives, there's almost never a good choice. There's almost never a choice that leaves us morally spotless, because that is not what life in the world is. And so every choice that we face is a choice that asks us to identify the lesser of evils, remembering that it's still an evil, but it's doing less evil, and that's extremely important. Oftentimes, that's a difficult judgment, and as I say, we're going to see those things differently. I don't want to, I editorialized a little bit at the end of my talk because I think it's not an issues-based election. It is about those other things. But as a general rule, I'm actually very reluctant to tell people how they should vote, how they should think about their citizenship. That's not my job. I'm not sure it's the church's job either. In fact, I'm rather sure it's not. The job is to become so converted that our faith leads our political behavior. And when we do that in a serious way, we're always implicated in sin. We're always implicated in sin. We have to take that seriously too and live with it.
If I may, it's a little bit ironic that I, as a Protestant, am talking about collectivity here. But I did want to say that I was listening to a podcast today about this election, and it was a podcast about how Muslims in the Midwest are going to vote or intend to vote. And what's very interesting to me was that the moral discernment was going on as a collectivity,
Mhm.
right? Both of them are terrible choices for Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan, for example, where there's a large Lebanese community. Terrible decisions, but the process of discernment was taking place within these mosques, and it was being done dialogically. And so, yes, I believe that there's a role for conscience and individual conscience in voting, but I also think that there's an important role for collective conversation and dialogue, not necessarily consensus all the time, right? Not necessarily voting en bloc, but I think that's an important role that the religious communities have to provide.
Thank you. We have a question for the panel. Currently, we have a sitting US president who is Catholic and a presidential candidate who is Catholic, but it seems like the type of Catholicism that Biden and Vance are in stark contrast to each other. They're types of Catholicism, I suppose. I've observed that Vance may be representative of a new breed of Catholic, often either recent converts or in the 35 to 40-year-old range. Just want to get the whole question here. That could be described as more hardcore in quotations, or outspoken in quotations, or back to tradition, or right wing than a more moderate older generation. He gives some other examples of people, recent converts: Shia LaBeouf, Candace Owen. I'm not sure I know all of these folks. Matt Walsh. Have you noticed this as well? And what do you think is causing this trend among some newer Catholics in the US? I don't know how to take that on.
Well, I've written about it. I've written about it, and that that's more or less my take. There's something rather poignant, I think, in the transition from how we think about Catholicism in the U.S., a transition from a sort of a Vatican II era perspective that we can identify with Joe Biden, whose adult life has been spent growing up with Vatican II. And I don't think of this in progressive or conservative or anything like that terms. I really think of it actually in terms of an orientation. Vatican II called the church to turn toward the world and enter into a dialogue with the world. One of the ways that I think the abortion politics of the last 40 years has harmed the church and the world so much is it has emphasized the way in which the church must confront and correct the world, set the church in opposition to the world. And the phrase that John Paul II used, and I've done some analysis of this, it really began to appear at a moment after 1987, after the Synod on the Laity in that year. We really began to see John Paul use the phrase dozens of times after that point, that the church must be a sign of contradiction. That is what I see represented by J.D. Vance. And again, to me, I don't think of this as a right-left thing. It's a question of that orientation. But I certainly agree. I think we're living in a moment where we are pivoting from a dominant framework of Catholicism in the United States that used to be engaged with the world and sought encounters with the world for dialogue, to a perspective that is opposed to the world, contradicting the world, correcting the world. My own point of view is that that's somewhat tragic. I often have said to students, the world is not beside the point of Christianity, or it would have been rather silly to create it. We are here for a reason. The world and the church accompany one another. To see it another way, I think, is dangerous, but I think it has arisen from the abortion politics, from the divisiveness, the polarization, our instinctive binary thinking has brought us to this, and it's a tragedy.
Yeah. I wonder if this might be related somewhat. I have a question here to what Jane was talking about, communal discernment. So when I was teaching in Minnesota, I taught with a number of folks who were cradle Catholics who grew up in small towns in Illinois, let's say, or Wisconsin, that were basically Catholic towns, and not idyllic or anything like that, but they were a place where Catholicism was sort of baked in, and it was a part of the community, and you had a place there, whether in, through the school process, whatever. Often it reflected a German community or a Polish community or what have you, where people had a place in a home. And I wonder if some of the newer converts are not seeking that as much as these basic issues, to be right on a particular issue, to have this, what you're talking about, not this consistent ethic of life. This is what it means to be Catholic, but I'm going to grasp this one issue and I'm going to make it the issue.
Yeah, and I think it speaks also to the hyper individualization of contemporary society. It also speaks to a lot of the, dare I say, Catholic evangelical alliances that are taking place politically, where, to my mind, I can't distinguish certain writers, within the Catholic world from evangelical writers with respect to not only their moral positions, but also the ways in which they do theology. It's a surprising thing to me to see this confluence. Yeah.
So I might have another question. There's one more up there, and I will not I will not miss that question because someone does have a question for Jane. But last week on my podcast, What Matters Most, I spoke with Bill Kavanaugh, a fellow Chicagoan now at DePaul University, in his most recent book, The Uses of Idolatry. And Bill talks about nationalism, of course, as an idol, as well as consumerism, others out there. But you mentioned the point that Catholic Democrats and Catholic Republicans are just like any other Democrat or Republican. I mean, do we see, like, Bill pushes against Christian nationalism, that kind of, he says nationalism is the problem, and I'm not sure if I agree with that entirely, because I do think Christianity gets itself in a lot of trouble when it adheres to a certain type of nationalism. But is it the case that nationalism, this belonging or this partisanship, is just more important than one's religion in terms of Catholicism or evangelicalism or anything?
I had about a 3-hour conversation on this very question yesterday with a good friend and a great scholar, and I can report that we did not arrive at a satisfactory answer. I think that, I take the point very much, and I'm grateful that Jane brought it up about communal discernment. I think that's important. I think it's a part of who we are. It's something that I'm trying to write about right now, and I'm finding it rather difficult. And the reason is because I think that those Catholic towns, John, that you talk about, or we might think about our parishes or whatever, that there is a sense that we create an us or a kind of an oikos, a kind of a household in these spaces. And there are dimensions of it that they're quite uplifting. They're quite vivifying. They deepen our engagement with one another and with God. But there comes a tricky point where that recognition of an us begins to demand a them. And that's where it becomes a problem. And this is where it becomes, I think, very hard for me to write about and also to think about how we engage this behavior politically. I understand what Bill's getting at about resisting the Christian part of nationalism, that nationalism itself is a problem. But I am struck also. There's a word that has come into usage across the last decade, Christianism. A number of Europeans have written about this, and it describes this phenomenon of Christian nationalism and some other things like it as well. But it's a Christianity that's not based on belief in the gospel. It's not based on a desire to become closer to God by becoming closer to one another. It's an idolatrous position. It's a position that needs a them to be defined against an us. And I think that is, really where we get into trouble. I think it's a very challenging problem. I also don't think that's the only idol that to which our Christian faith is susceptible. There are many scriptural lessons, I think, about how quickly our faith can slide into something that's not our faith. And so I think we always have to be alert to that. But I also would want to say it has eluded me to find a good way to talk about it that illuminates beyond what I've said here to try to point to a good rule or something like that. I think it has political consequences. There's a reason I'm thinking about it, but I think at this point I can only say it's an extremely challenging problem that is very present.
Yeah, I would want to say that, the Canadian context is quite a bit different insofar as it's, kind of blithely secular, we're nice people as Canadians and we're nice people as liberal Christians, and it's hard to tell us apart sometimes, right? But I think that the Canadian liberal churches, at least the Protestant churches, I think, and the Catholic church, is absorbed basically into the Canadian national project without there being a great deal of distinction. And we see this most clearly in the residential schools, but we also see this in the ways in which Canada endorses the same kinds of policies vis-a-vis Indigenous people, or the Canadian churches do, as the nation state does. So Christians can never think against the state in Canada. The state always leads, and then Christians blithely follow whatever's left of us in Canada anyway. And we blithely follow the kind of lead that Canadian liberalism takes. So, for example, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's hardly any critiques of the TRC in Canada, despite the fact that it's among the churches, that is, despite the fact that Indigenous scholars complain all the time about the TRC as being a kind of nationalist project that wants to reconcile Indigenous people to the Canadian nation state. But you will never hear that critique within the churches. Why? Because we're so indebted still to the nationalist project. So the kinds of Christian collectivities I'm most interested in are the ones that are anti-nationalist, to be honest. Those are the most interesting ones.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask both of them. They're not identical, but they deal with a question of abortion. So Jane mentioned the dignity of life, but how does prohibiting access to abortion respect the dignity of women's lives as well? And then I'll ask a second question. Both President Biden, a Democrat, and Prime Minister Trudeau, a liberal, are devout Catholics and support the women's right to choose whether to abort or not if her life is threatened. Now it's either pro-abortion or anti-abortion. So how can this issue of abortion, pro-life or pro-choice be reconciled to a middle ground? And I think Steve's already talked about that a bit, I think, and I will leave it open if you would both like to answer those questions.
Well, I mean, I've already come out as a Protestant, so I'm allowed to answer this question very, very openly, I guess. So to the first question, prohibiting access to abortion, how does it respect the dignity of women's lives? It doesn't. Well, that's just point blank. It doesn't, it cannot. I think that obviously the dignity of women's lives is profoundly constrained by the prohibition of abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of gestured in that direction as well. It's a false choice if we reduce it to one or the other. We can't extricate one from the other. And so I would agree with Jane. I think we have to engage the issue in a more serious sort of way. On the second question, I will confess I am sort of constitutionally indisposed to middle grounds of most descriptions, because I don't think the middle ground challenges us enough. The truth is actually not always in the middle. I'm very suspicious of the sort of binary two-sided point of view that says the truth must be somewhere in the middle. Maybe that is true, but I think we also find truth in other places. So what I would say is to gesture back to something that I said earlier, that I think it's not so much identifying a middle ground as it is taking seriously the kinds of challenges that I mentioned before. And one of those challenges is the hard facts of medicine and biology that we know, and that our moral tradition has not adequately reflected on yet. And this is not me saying that I want to change the magisterial teaching on abortion. This is me saying that what we believe is not yet adequately expressed. And in a similar way, I would gesture to what I said about believers who are coming from religious motivations and have different ideas about when a fetus becomes a person. It's not really a question of when life begins. It's a question of when we consider a fetus to be a person. Roman Catholic Church and Western Christianity has a very clear answer to that. Other believers have different answers to that question. And in a social community, we have to engage the complexity of what it means for us to live with religiously motivated consciences that have different answers to a very important question. I don't think the answer to that is a middle ground. I think the answer to that is it requires sustained discourse, conversation. Above both of those, it requires sustained listening so that we can come to understand really where everyone is coming from and begin to understand the values that we have to bear in mind as we come to something like a way that we can all live together in peace, disagreeing about important things.
I'll just say briefly, this is maybe a pedantic point, but I don't think that Justin Trudeau is a devout Catholic per se. And with respect to this issue, neither was his father. I mean, I think fundamentally, with respect to personal issues, personal moral issues, sexual issues, they were fundamentally liberals, right? And so those were choices that were to be made by the individual, and that superseded any Catholic faith that either of them had.
Any further comments or questions that either you, Steve, or Jane have? We have dealt with all of the questions here that have been asked on really significant and serious issues, which this whole conversation has been grounded in. Really important discussion. Any final thoughts or closing thoughts?
May I just ask a brief question to Steve? Just a very brief one. So where does liberation theology fit into the consistent ethic of life in your view? How might a liberation theologian apply it? Or would they perhaps not wish to embrace it?
I think that the liberative perspective has to animate a consistent ethic of life, because where I have tried to orient my own understanding in my own writing about it, where I think the church is coming from about the consistent ethic, is calling our attention to the peripheries. calling our attention away from the comfortable to those who are suffering, and centering the margins in that way. In that way, I would say that the perspective of liberation theology lives inside and animates a properly understood consistent ethic of life. But that is to say then too, the consistent ethic of life is not itself any kind of idol. It is not anything that it is not a God for us to worship apart from Christianity. It's a perspective on what Christianity calls us to and asks us to do with great moral and spiritual seriousness in our public life together. But I think what we have learned from Father Gustavo, and I think what we have learned from 2 generations or 3 generations now of theologians who have followed him and have expanded that liberative perspective down many different avenues. I think what we have learned is the importance of recognizing that I have to begin from my own horizon, because my context is the only one I actually have. But I also have to retain the openness to recognizing that I will never really bear witness to life, and I will never really grieve all of the suffering that I need to be grieving, unless I can open my perspective to the peripheries, to the suffering of others. In other words, I don't see any tension there. I see a fruitful conversation. That's probably something I should have done more of in the book. I was, as for reasons I talked about at the top, pretty focused on this election and this moment for a variety of reasons. But I invite anybody within the sound of my voice to continue the development of the consistent ethic of life. This would be a wonderful article or book. Perhaps I'll write it, but perhaps others can write it too.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to then at least go back to something that you were sort of talking about, Steve, in your own comments towards the end. This is from page 95 of your book. Underneath all the questions that this book has addressed, we find one necessary condition that must exist before we can be faithful citizens: that there is a political system operating according to the rule of law, and that is responsive to the preferences of citizens who engage one another in political debate to make public policy through fair elections. And I think this touches too, for me, on Jane's comments about, the structural issues in terms of our politics, and how we have to look beyond just particular issues and particular individuals to the systemic issues, to the institutional issues. So I thank you so much for being here with us, both to Dr. Steve Millies, to Dr. Jane Barter. I thank all of you for coming. I appreciate it very much. I know some of you are coming from places where it's later than here, including our panelists. And I thank Fang Fang for her help in making this work. So good night to you all. And there's Fang Fang. Thank you. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful to both of you and to everyone. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.